Thank you all for coming, and a special thanks to Dr. Saket Moon, who has kindly agreed to give his talk today on the economics of caste in America. Uh, Saket works on social and economic history and is currently research associate at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Delhi. He completed his PhD from Center for Study on Social Inclusion and Inclusive Policy at JNU. So I'm sure that all of us are going to learn a lot of things from Dr. Saket, and I really look forward to listening to you, Dr. Saket. Over to you, sir.
I hope this the presentation is visible.
Yes, yes.
So I'll start.
Yeah, it's
So
visible.
yeah, uh, thank you very much, Dr. Vikas, for the introduction, and to the organizers for giving us this opportunity to present today. So this is a co-authored paper on the economics of caste in Ambedkar, and what was the motivation behind for us to write this paper. So the first motivation, that on one hand we see that the economic literature on caste has grown in recent years, and especially with a lot of empirical studies coming in on how discrimination operates. However, one thing that we saw which was missing was that there is an entire tradition of anti-caste movement in India, and it has produced a body of work on the economic nature of caste. And this body was not represented in the current literature on the economic studies on caste. And many of these empirical studies then lack a clear theoretical framework on how caste operates on the economic domain of caste. And there are exceptions to this. There have been studies on uh, especially on Ambedkar, because there are many anti-caste thinkers, and before we began this paper, we were thinking of covering a lot of different thinkers in one paper, but then we decided to focus on Ambedkar to begin with. And there are a few studies that we have mentioned here, which are on Ambedkar and his contribution to the economic study of the economic dimension of caste. And moving ahead, so when we went to Ambedkar's writings, and we are mostly looking at Ambedkar's collected writings as well as his official representations to commissions and debates in legislative bodies, and his other correspondence that he has had, we found that Ambedkar has a framework. Now, there is no single writing wherein he enunciates this framework, but there is an overarching framework where Ambedkar considers that caste has not only a social, a cultural, and a political domain, but also an economic domain. Caste has a economic mechanism of its functioning, and we are trying to synthesize that framework into a paper. So uh, we begin with Ambedkar's unit of analysis and framework. Now, firstly, Ambedkar does not consider individual as the unit of social analysis. Why? Now, Ambedkar sees that there are individuals do exist, but they exist as a part of a social class. So, Ambedkar, as you can see from the quote that we put here, Ambedkar denies the atomistic conception of individuals, meaning that he sees individual choices as framed within their social context, within their economic context. And when Ambedkar talks of classes, he does not see class as a simple economic category. And this is something that he critiques time and again, especially in his critique of the Marxian understanding of class, wherein, as we can see from Ambedkar's description of upper classes, he sees within his description of upper classes, he has four subcategorizations of upper classes, which being the landowners and the authorities under native powers, which are basically the rulers of the native states, the commercial classes, higher employees of the government, that is the higher bureaucracy, and Brahmins. And with this, he also adds people who live by the pen, meaning the scribal caste, like Prabhus and Kayasts. And in the end, he notes that the last class, that is Brahmins and the scribal caste, have the most influence, even though many of them live in abject poverty. And this is something that he sort of, his logic here is influence, or rather power, and or if we can even connect it with the idea of hegemony, that these classes, that there are different classes, there are not just two classes, there are different classes, and it is not just an, they don't just draw their power the from their economic status. And further, he sees caste as a relational problem. Now, what does this mean? uh, there is this very famous quote of Ambedkar where he says that the problem of the untouchables is not just the problem of untouchables; it is a symptom of the caste system itself, and that is what we mean when we say caste is a relational problem. That it is not just a problem of any particular social group, but these problems are a symptom of the entire way the society, the entire way in which a society is organized. And in it, Ambedkar argues that his logic behind his critique of caste is that he wants to do away with the dogma of predestination and bring in the freedom of contract. Now, what does this mean? It means that Ambedkar wants there to be a freedom of contract between employers and uh, and their prospective employees, and caste not coming in between as an intermediary. And another thing that Ambedkar argues is that he does not just make a moral argument against caste; he makes an economic argument. And he repeatedly, in many different places, notes that an economic organization based upon caste is inherently an inefficient economic organization, wherein high unemployment is generated because employment is not done on the basis of merit, on the basis of qualifications, but rather on the basis of caste. And this sort of an economic organization hinders economic progress. And in going into much more detail into his critique, he especially builds a strong critique against the traditional mode of agrarian economy, wherein the example that we are taking here is his critique against the Bombay Hereditary Office Act of 1874, where the BHOA was brought in to regulate a system of hereditary caste-based village officers in Western India and called Baludidari. And therein, what it ultimately did was that rather than ameliorating the effects of such hereditary caste-based officers, it put the entire burden upon the untouchable caste, especially Mahars. And here, Ambedkar's critique of the BHOA enumerates what kind of uh, features, economic features, this particular mode of traditional agrarian economy has. Wherein he says that untouchable, especially Mahars, this is very much in the context of the Bombay Heritage Office Act, have to face irregular hours, they have to face meager remuneration and wet begar or bigari, corvi, basically. But at the same time, he also says that there is an economic basis of humiliation and the death of ambition. Now, what he means from the death of ambition is that the end of any form of ambition for social and economic mobility. And the sort of his entire argument, wherein he brings in self-respect, says that it cannot be brought in a system which has such a form of economic organization, wherein if you rally against such kinds of practices, you will be faced with a loss of employment. Uh, Ambedkar not only critiques the agrarian economy, but also sort of his works also show what kind of discrimination the untouchables, especially the untouchables, have to face under capitalism and the industrial economy. And from the quote, we can see how Ambedkar notes that when dealing with an industrial economy, the basic idea that all things being equal are not equal actually. And herein Ambedkar brings in his theorization of Brahminism, which he basically says is the denial of liberty, equality, and fraternity. But more specifically, he says that even under capitalism, we see the same kind of caste structures being replicated, which in his description, for example, in the textile mills, certain offices are reserved sort of for the untouchables and they cannot move to higher paying offices. Similarly, in the railways, wherever the untouchable worker might come into contact with an upper caste officer, those offices are closed off to the untouchable worker. And he also notes the situation of precarity that untouchable workers face, wherein he notes that under recessions, they are the first ones to be fired, and when there is an economic boom, they are the last ones to be hired. And he also discusses the discrimination faced in government employment, wherein he notes that even though there are qualified candidates available, they are denoted as not found suitable, as not being suitable, and they are discriminated against because there is no governmental policy, there is no specific policy of affirmative action that can counter discrimination, and thus the state itself encourages discrimination in a way. So Ambedkar here notes discrimination both in the industrial economy as well as government employment under capitalism. Now, how do these discriminations sort of operate? One example, as in we have already covered Bombay Hereditary Officers Act. Another such example is a legal code like Punjab Land Alienation Act, wherein untouchable peasants were denied or rather debarred from holding lands. But at the same time, there are social codes and prohibiting ownership of wealth or assets. And herein Ambedkar notes that ancient social codes, which his critics said are no longer sort of applicable to the study of a modern society, he notes that even though they are not directly applicable, but the mechanism of discrimination, the mechanism that is enumerated within those codes is still being practiced, even if those codes are not directly linked, even if those codes are not directly invoked. So he notes that there are social codes that are still practiced. And this brings us to our own theorization of what Ambedkar is trying to describe here, which is a social constraint on consumption. Now, there are economic constraints on consumption, but within Ambedkar's work, this comes up regularly that there are social constraints on consumption, and consumption here uh, denotes both consumption of commodities and consumption of services. So we have given some examples here, like for example, in certain places there was a ban on untouchables wearing pagdis or dhotis or gold or silver ornaments, whereas also in consumption of services, certain artisanal castes like washermen and barbers would deny untouchables their service even in lieu of payment because of certain social constraints that were there. And we see even in our own contemporary society, we see such examples come up time and again. So, moving on, another thing that Ambedkar notes very strongly, and this we see in his political activism as well, especially in from examples like the Mahar Satyagraha, wherein we see he notes that segregation is a very important mechanism through which caste operates in the social and economic domain, wherein segregation of public spaces and amenities, which are for all public, but are denied to a certain section of the population, is a very important mechanism, and which is linked to not only uh, denial of services but also denial of opportunities like education, and we'll come to that later. Uh, but with public amenities and also access to spaces, the segregation of spaces being closely linked with power, in the sense that while segregation remained permanent, it could be increased if it was felt by the upper caste that the untouchable castes are sort of giving up degrading practices. They could be debarred from entering villages, denied all access to water, so on and so forth. So, coming to education, which is also a part of, which is also a result of segregation, we see in Ambedkar education not as, and again, when we are understanding education and the anti-caste movement, and I think Philip Constable's work is there on how education becomes the site of contest for the anti-caste movement. In Ambedkar, education is not just linked to a social status, but also it has an economic function. Now, what is the economic function of education? Ambedkar notes very clearly that education is linked to employment. And if higher education, especially higher education, and if higher education was not linked to employment, many castes would not even bother to go for an higher education. And so denying that education, denying higher education to a certain section of the population is directly denying them economic opportunities. And education is very as closely linked with economic and social mobility. But he also notes that education has also become a traditional caste occupation for some castes, like the Brahmins, like the tribal caste. And in this way, we see that while a certain section of population is completely denied education, a certain section of population has adopted it as the traditional caste occupation. Yeah. So how is this entire edifice maintained? And Ambedkar is very clear that it is not maintained by some natural law or this is a natural evolution of Indian society, but he maintains that it is maintained at the point of a bayonet by force. And this force takes two forms. One is direct violence, and secondly, social boycott. And as we saw earlier, with the social constraints on consumption, if untouchables were seen to take up certain indicators of social status, like certain forms of clothing or ornamentation, they would face social boycott. And this boycott was not faced by the individuals who were rallying against these norms, but the entire collective. And in this way, violence and coercion played a very central role in maintaining the operation of caste within the social and economic domain. And another other forms of social boycott would include denial of employment opportunities to an entire caste within a village, or not having any form of economic relations with the untouchable caste within a certain region. And this sort of forced caste to operate based on traditional caste norms. So, what was Ambedkar's framework for an emancipatory economic policy? Now, we all know, and I think this point has been raised by many other scholars, that Ambedkar was a great proponent of state socialism. But his advocacy for state socialism was not just because of certain of an idea of justice or because of his roots in Fabian socialism, but rather he saw socialism as a way to counter caste. Now, how? For example, with the nationalization of land, Ambedkar notes in the Constituent Assembly debate that land is crucially linked with caste status, with social status, and so nationalization of land would ensure that this sort of a status marker does not remain a status marker anymore. Similarly, he's a great proponent of industrialization. As we saw, he critiques the agrarian economy, is arguing for freedom of contract, and to bring in this industrialization, he is arguing for state socialism, which would bring in a rapid industrialization of the country. Along with these, he is arguing for fundamental rights. Now, fundamental rights for Ambedkar, and in Ambedkar, there is this question of majority, political majority, and a political minority, which comes up again and again. And he notes that untouchable castes are political minorities within the village and within the nation, and therefore fundamental rights have to be beyond the possibility of amendment by a political majority. And moving ahead, so some other frameworks that he, some other measures that he recommends are legal and constitutional remedies against discrimination, against violence, ensuring representation, not only political representation, but representation in employment, in education, in all spheres of uh, economic activity, industrialization and urbanization, as I've already mentioned, and economic, social, and political reforms. Now, coming to the last part of our presentation, what is the relevance of this study today? And which is a very valid question. That first of all, Ambedkar, as a critical thinker who has contributed to the study of caste, who has probably contributed more than anybody else to the study of caste, his writings are still today a valuable source from wherein we can see not just descriptions of how discrimination operates, how caste operates, and how caste hierarchies are reproduced, but also his analysis on why this is happening and in what and the theoretical frameworks to understand these phenomena. And many of these phenomena have sort of are still relevant today because privileges and disadvantages are historically transmitted. So, for example, if we look at the Bombay Hereditary Offices Act, or even more specifically to the Punjab Land Alienation Act, we see that landlessness amongst Dalits is highest in Punjab even today. So, Ambedkar's description and critique of the Punjab Land Alienation Act still becomes relevant today. At the same time, Ambedkar himself notes that caste being a dynamic structure, there are many changes, and even there are from the description that we have provided, we can see that there are many differences between Ambedkar description and from what we see today. However, there are also a lot of continuities, and these continuities, many of these continuities deal with caste as an economic structure, and through Ambedkar's analysis, we can still use them to study and theorize upon caste as we see it today. And so, coming to an end, the framework for the study of caste needs a theoretical framework which is also historically grounded, which has an understanding of how history operates, how as an institution, a dynamic institution operates through history, and how structural barriers and privileges sort of come into play. So this is something that we are looking at in our paper, and we'll be finishing it up very soon. And so I think with this, I will end my presentation here, and we can move to the question and answer session. that is possible.
Thank you, Dr. Moon. Thank you. So if we have the questions, we can put it on the chat box. Yeah, that would be great. In the meantime, let me emphasize one thing. When we as scholars speak in a very specialized kind of platform like this, we the speakers, we take some of the speakers for granted. So sorry, some of the audience to be for granted. So in the benefit of the larger audience, I just would like to put 2 points for all of us. Is why Dr. Ambedkar's economic thought needs to be put in perspective. So generally, we try to consider Dr. Ambedkar in a light that, okay, he's a typical Dalit scholar. Okay? But just try to understand that he was foremost an economist. He went to pursue his master's and PhD from Columbia, and then subsequently from LSE as an economist, right? Most of the other people who went outside India, they went to pursue law. Right? That is one very important thing that we need to keep in mind. And arguably, we can say that in whole of Constituent Assembly, he was the single most I say, biggest scholar in the uh, whole of Constituent Assembly, especially in economics. First few of his writings, for example, his Columbia thesis was based on center-state relationship and provincial finances. His doctoral thesis at LSE was problem of the rupee. So he was not concerned. He did not concern himself a lot from the political and social thoughts, which he generally regarded as post, in our understanding. But he was foremost economic scholar. That is for the benefit of the larger audience, which, when we discuss about Ambedkar, we take it for granted. And second thing uh, is his there was a resurgence of interest in Dr. Ambedkar around the time 1990. That is around his birth centenary, and a lot of scholars invested a lot of time and resources to to reinvent Dr. Ambedkar, his writings, because first 30, 40, 30, 35, 40 years of the post independence, his writings were not that was useful for academic purposes, but not in a popular debate. And so these 2 points I thought would be a good idea. It may be a good idea to put this in front of the larger audience. In the meantime, do we have questions? That would be great to.
Vikas have sent one to Saket directly. Should I just ask it?
Yeah, that would be great, Ruchira. Please go ahead.
Um, I'm wondering also how Ambedkar responded to other economists of his time, right? Like one of the big issues that he writes about is the problem of the Indian rupee, where he's asking for fixed exchange rates. Meanwhile, straight after that period, that is the time when the Keynesian revolution is starting, and Keynes is asking for flexible exchange rates, low rates of interest, and liquidity, like unconstrained liquidity outside of that, outside of fixed exchange rates. Similarly, how did Ambedkar relate to the classics? How did he relate to Smith and Marx? I'm sure is very well documented. So, can you comment a little on those things?
Thanks, Ruchira. Wonderful question.
So I think, yeah, there are two questions that you have asked. I think Dr. Ishan is here as well. I think he, he'll take the first question, but I'll just briefly comment on the second question, his relation to Smith and Marx. So as you said, his analysis of Marx is very well documented. But what we feel is that his analysis of Marx, and he is looking at Marx in both the sympathetic light as well as in a critical light. And in a critical light, as he wherein he relates to how Marx applies to Indian society, and this is nowhere more clear than his address to the railway workers at Manmad. This is in 1936, I think. Yeah. So where he basically, where which we also mentioned in the presentation, wherein he notes that there are not just two classes in Indian society, there are very many classes, and Marx himself never noted that there are only two classes. Uh, So regarding a lot of different, regarding the political question, how would a revolution come about? He critiques Marx, but also he retains a lot of, Marxian political economy in different places. With regard to Smith, and I think I mentioned here freedom of contract, wherein he talks about the traditional society, traditional agrarian society, agrarian economy, he mentioned that he wants to bring in freedom of contract. However, in another place in 1943, in a 1943 speech on parliamentary democracy, he mentioned that freedom of contract is good, but there have to be limits on freedom of contract as well. And he gives in the example of Western economies, wherein freedom of contract between unequals is a right to exploit. And so there is this nuance in Ambedkar, wherein rather than mentioning that freedom of contract is like a universal good, he sees it as something important in a caste-based society, but in a capitalist society, it can also lead to exploitation. I think uh, with regards to the first question, if Ishan can take over.
Thank you, Saket, for conveniently giving me the difficult question. Hi, Ruchira, Vikas. So yeah, no, I'll just start by saying, so Vikas said, Ambedkar, the role of Ambedkar as an economist. I think that is absolutely right. But I think what is less acknowledged is the fact that Ambedkar, as far as caste is concerned, is a political economist, or specifically a heterodox economist in his method of studying caste or group identity. So that is also something to be noted. To not answer Ruchira's question, I think we have not looked at it, Ruchira. We have looked at just we have restricted our study as of now to caste and Ambedkar's, Ambedkar taking on caste and Ambedkar taking on other authors on caste, but we have not looked at his economic contributions and how his, non-caste economics of Ambedkar. We have not looked at it because it's in itself quite vast. And very quickly, I don't know if we have time, but there are some questions in the comments. Should I take it right now?
Yeah, please, please.
Okay, so
Please,
there is a
Ishan.
question on caste as a social and cultural context. Sure, it is a cultural and a social construct, but of course, it also has a very strong economic function. And in fact, the works of Balmurli Natarajan and others, so they talk about how caste has been restricted as a cultural phenomena, but the economics of it is gone, which is important to address, and hence this paper. Caste, the role of caste in labor market segmentation in India. So it's very much there. So there are several studies including Azim Premji University, State of Working India, and there are several studies which do talk about presence of segmentation, labor market segmentation by caste. They do note that it has changed a bit, and in the sense that there are newer occupations. There was no gig work, when Ambedkar was writing. But what scholars have noted is this: that even the newer occupations, there is a caste sorting. So, for instance, if there's a completely new occupation, completely new industry, there you could see a caste-based hierarchy, as far as in the sense who occupies the lower rungs of the new occupation and who occupies the higher rung of the occupation, as far as so it replicates the caste hierarchy. uh, I think I'll just take one more. This thing about Dalit capitalism and whether capitalism can eradicate caste and whether Dalit capitalism is the way to go about it. Uh, from Ambedkar's work, Ambedkar would argue very strongly against it. In fact, in several places, he notes that capital, if first of all, he says, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, I don't know if capital can do it. Capital can, erase the kind of deprivation we have. And even if it is allowed to do, it will create massive inequalities, as is seen in the Western countries. So Ambedkar is sort of vehemently against, letting the private capital rule, and in the hopes of getting rid of caste-based disparities. And as Sakit noted, he is very much in the favor of state socialism. Albeit he talks about a democratic route, so he's against violence in that sense. I think I'll stop here. There are some
Can
more,
I ask,
Sakit. I don't know if we have
can I
time.
ask one question? If just it will not just kind of curious. So as I understand Marx, he said that economics is the basis of all the social relations. Does we have an understanding from Dr. Ambedkar that economics is the basis of all the caste relations in India? Does he say something of this sort in paraphrase or in more detail?
Saket, I'll take this first if you want to add on. So no, so in Marx, I think the basis of class formation is the production relations basically, and where does one person fall in the class ladder will depend upon the ownership of means of production and what where does that person fall in. In Ambedkar, I think Ambedkar makes it very clear in at least two places where he says that caste flows not just from economic power, but there are at least three, four kinds of other political power, including religious power. And he actually keeps going back throughout his texts. He keeps going back to the to the fact that caste draws its sanctity from religious texts. So in Ambedkar, it definitely is not just coming from ownership or of means of production or the production relation. Having said that, there are several places where he does put a lot of emphasis on economic power also. So, it's not either or in Ambedkar. That is my take.
Thanks, Ishan, and thanks, Saket. Sharmin, do we have more time for the questions? There are a few questions. Sharmin,
yes, we have actually a good 10 minutes left to ask questions. So in fact, in the Q&A box, I think there are another
yes.
2-3 major questions being asked by Ishan and Habravish. Yeah. So we can we have time to cover that, and maybe in 10 minutes, anything else the presenters also want to say, we have time for that. Yeah.
So the question from Ishan Senolikar. Should I ask the question, Ishan, or you will go ahead with it?
Do you want to add
Actually,
something at this stage?
sorry, may I interrupt you? Actually, Vikas, maybe you could read out the questions, since I
Okay,
think
so that
the
everybody can,
entire
yeah.
the audience
Yes.
can't see these questions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay. So Ishan Senolikar has asked this question. I'm sorry if I pronounced the name incorrectly. Can we say that classes have now broadened and now studied under identity economics? Would it be viable to use Dr. Ambedkar's view to study phenomena looking at economics of identity, or would it be different? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take this being an economist. So, it's classes have definitely broadened in the sense that, of course, as economies changed, as societies and class structures change. As I said, there are newer occupations. There are newer intermediary classes and all kinds of classes. But so it is definitely so. The point is, how do we study a phenomena? So, do we have an underlying theory? So in Ambedkar, so the where Saket left, his presentation was the fact that one can draw up a framework from Ambedkar, and that framework can be used. So in Ambedkar, there is an existing framework which says that look, caste is this dynamic thing. It draws power not just from economic but other sources. It is an exploitative thing, and these are the ways that it works. So one can definitely use that framework to look at economics of identity. Now, others have also studied economics of identity. People like Akerlof and others like Gary Becker, but their framework is mainly the neoclassical framework. So their whole thing comes from utility maximizing rational individuals, and that could be very limiting when we are looking at group inequalities. Because then, if a group is not doing well, you could argue that look, this group is not getting adequate wages because probably because their marginal product of labor is low, so they are not contributing enough to the society anyway. But so here is where Ambedkar's framework becomes so important, that there are structural barriers. It's not just about one bad apple, one bad mean racist or a casteist employer, but rather there are structural barriers which reproduce caste hierarchies, and this is also very, very dynamic. So in that sense, Ambedkar has a very, very powerful framework, but it is understudied, and that framework itself is not explicitly laid out, not even by Ambedkar, but also not by any scholars that we know of. An economic framework to study Ambedkar. So that is where the utility of our study comes in, and we hope to make some sort of a framework which may be useful later.
Yeah.
I
thanks, Ishan. Yeah. Haberwish has two questions. First, if you can clarify any difference between Dr. Ambedkar's vision of state socialism and some Marxist vision of market socialism. Second, given the vast changes that have taken place in the social grades various castes now occupy as against the time of Dr. Ambedkar, would you still argue that Dr. Ambedkar's conceptualization of social class is still satisfactory for political economic theorization? So these are the two questions.
So, hi, Abhravesh. So, I'll say that Dr. Ambedkar's vision of state socialism and the description that he makes of it, wherein he talks about nationalization of land, nationalization of industry, uh, as well as bringing in limitations on the market. I think that is a very unique vision and quite different from the idea of market socialism, uh, because he's speaking about socialism in a much traditional sense, if I can say so, wherein we have nationalization of land and industry. Uh, for the second question, wherein I think what you are asking is that certain castes have encountered or have undergone some modicum of social and economic progress, and is Dr. Ambedkar's conceptualization still satisfactory for current for our contemporary theorization? I think so. See, as I mentioned in my presentation, caste being a dynamic structure, there are changes that have happened, but there are also continuities. Now, it is up to us to see what aspects of Dr. Ambedkar's theorization are still relevant and which ones might be there might be aspects that might not be relevant anymore. As well as I think when we are looking at theorization, when we're looking at uh, what he says about specific caste, but rather about the structure of caste, the entire institution of caste, and how even though there are changes within that institution, there are exchanges, or rather there is mobility happening within that institution. Is the structure changing, or is the structure still the same, or rather similar? So I think with that uh, caveat, we can actually still argue that Dr. Ambedkar's conceptualization of social class, being not just economic class and being sort of a nexus of many different axes of power, being economic, political, educational, religious, so on and so forth, is still relevant to a large degree. Dr. Ishan, if you would like to add anything to it.
I'm fine. I think this is the last question. I don't know if we have time, but Kavita is asking about structural barriers and privileges. I think the structural barriers are so one needs to differentiate between how an employer discriminates against an individual, let's say on the basis of gender or sexuality or caste or race, which is quite straightforward. But you know that is where most of the economic studies are focused on measuring discrimination, quantifying discrimination, audit studies, all kinds of studies. But there are other sort of unseen structural barriers, or not so obvious sort of structural barriers and privileges. So for instance, all these social codes, unwritten social codes, or institutionally some groups being favored by policy. So, for instance, I'll just give you an example. For instance, Green Revolution in India, very, very prominent. But Green Revolution obviously ended up benefiting the land owning classes a lot more. And the fact that the scheduled castes in Punjab were not allowed to own land historically, it meant that an entire group could not benefit. Now, no study in Green Revolution in India, but typically talks about this. But it is a structural issue. So one could think of several structural barriers and privileges that different groups face, which is not really quantified very easily using blinder Rohaka or other kinds of methods, and hence it is ignored. But it's important to look at. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Ishan and Sakit. So we have hand of Kiran raised. Kiran, do you have something to say? Your hand is raised. Or
Okay, sorry, 1 second. My
yes,
video is-
yes, Sharmil, please.
Actually, I think the attendees cannot unmute themselves or switch their cameras on. So I don't know if Kiran or anybody else has a question, you'll have to type it into the Q&A box. Or so if that's the case, we still have like 2 minutes, to before we can end this conversation. So if I, as I said, either the speakers want to say something or one quick question from the audience or one of the panelists, we have time.
Well, I think order of precedence dictates
Or
that
just,
order of precedence dictates that the speakers
yeah,
should have the say.
yeah.
In case you guys miss something and you would like to add something next 2 minutes.
Saket, do you want to?
I think I have made my presentation. I think if you want to add something.
Fine. I just
And
know
Ishan
I
has
don't
actually
really.
typed something that he
Okay.
wants to know the relation between land reforms and caste. So I think if you could elaborate on it.
Land reforms and caste. So Ambedkar was very particular about land reforms and caste, and it is easy to see the connection because he keeps on talking about land being the source of economic power, political power, opportunities. So he was explicit about the need for land reforms, and that unfortunately has gone off the radar in the last 30, 40 years. But overall, I think what I want to say is one that it's a privilege to be here. It's not very frequently we come across HET conferences. So congratulations and thank you for having us. Secondly, I think once we started to do this work, we did feel kind of isolated because it's hard to get direction and comments. So in that sense, we are very pleased to get all the questions, and we'll circulate the paper, and we'll look forward to all the criticisms and comments and everything else. So thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Ishan and Saket. It was quite insightful, and we had the privilege to listen to it live. So thank you. Over to you, Sharmin.
Yeah, so I think so now we have our next presentation by Shahana. So I think I'll pass over the mic to Avninder, who can introduce Shahana and yeah, conduct the discussion. Thanks. Yeah.
Thanks,
Ishan, and thanks, Ishan and Saket and Vikas.
Thanks
Yeah.
for having us. Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
So I can't see the speaker. Is he around? Yeah. Okay, Sana. So I think, yeah. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. So our next speaker is Sahana, who is pursuing her PhD from Hyderabad Central University. And in fact, her topic is quite interesting on the question of interest, understanding Abu Ala Madodi's contribution to Eastern Islamic economic thought through his engagement with interest from 1936 to 1960. So it's very important because, in fact, most of the times when we study Islamic idea about interest, it's more concentrated around ethical dimensions, okay, moral dimensions. So what I could see here, it's more about embedded within the economics logic and political economics logic. So I'm very eager to listen to your presentations. So maybe you have 20 minutes and then we can have some brief conversations, and we'll take some questions from the audience. So is that fine with you, Sana?
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfectly fine. Thank you.
Okay, so you have 20 minutes, and in fact, if I missed something about you, because I somehow, so please still also if add some points about you also. So about your education and all, that would be also better. Okay, over to you, Sana.
Yeah. Is my PowerPoint visible? Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. So thank you so much, Sharmin, for inviting me. It was quite unexpected. And hello, everyone. Thank you, sir. So the title, as already mentioned, is about interest. So getting into it. Interest, that is excess charged beyond principal in debt transactions, is an entrenched aspect of modern finance. The available evidence of the practice of interest dates back to the written history of humanity itself. Likewise, the written discourse on interest flourished in the history of economic thought from Jewish thought to the present. In Islamic tradition, according to the dominant view among ulama, interest-based transactions fall into the category of riba. So I don't have time to explain everything, but this riba classification is quite complex within Islamic jurisprudence. So riba is also one among the 7 deadly sins in Islam. Throughout the history of Islamic jurisprudence, ulama differed on the scope of riba. However, the differences were limited to business transactions. In loans, both decreasing and increasing the debt amount against an early or delayed payment of debt is forbidden by all major schools of Sunni Islam. Also, it's quite similar in Shia Islam as well. So, the emergence of innovative ways of wealth generation under modern finance capitalism posed novel challenge to Islamic scholars as they had to adjudicate the legality of these financial innovations. Besides, the inferior economic and political status of Muslim community compared to the West prompted many scholars to embrace modern banking system to achieve economic prosperity. For instance, Manazir Hassan Gilani, a prominent Islamic scholar from India, not only exempted all forms of banking from the ambit of riba, but also accused the Muslim capitalists who denounce interest of committing crimes against the community, since wealth, instead of empowering the community, is strengthening un-Islamic forces. So, Maududdi's intervention in the discourse of interest happened in this context. It has a reaction to the conflict among the Muslim intelligentsia on the validity of interest in Islam. Also, Maududdi's engagement with the question of interest is manifold, of which a major share belongs to Islamic jurisprudence. However, this paper focuses only on the economic dimension of his critique of interest. Maududdian critique of interest. The question that Maududi asks primarily is interest rational and economically justifiable? He engages with major justifications of interest in classical economic thought. First of all, interest is rationalized as a compensation for the risk the lender undertakes in giving away the money for a period which they could have utilized for their own advantage. Hence, charging interest is similar to charging rent on properties. Maududi recognized the risk involved in debt transactions, but interest for risk is groundless since risk is not quantifiable. What do you mean by the risk is not quantifiable is that there are limitations in predetermining the risk. So it's not a quantifiable commercial commodity. Moreover, the lender has the choice either to demand security for the debt or deny the loan. Demand for the opportunity cost is legitimate only in case of commercial loans. However, predetermination of fixed opportunity cost in the form of interest is illogical due to the probability of both profit and loss from the investment. Rent is also not applicable either on money or on goods like rice, since these are expendable commodities. Here, adhering to the money in the concept of scholastic and classical economic thought, Maududi confuted interest. So it's classical economic, there is slight difference between the scholastic thought and Islamic thought, but I'm not getting into the details. The second justification of interest is that along with money, time is also being lent. Time has value and the interest is being charged for the time. Maududi recognizes the significance of time in business. Also, this is quite similar to the classical Islamic thought. Unlike the scholastics, in classical Islamic thought, time has value. Time is recognized an element in determining the price. However, its predetermination is wrong. However, presuming the interest of money without considering the possibilities of profit and loss is wrong. Hence, gaining profit through partnership only logical. The third rationale for interest is that Profitability is an intrinsic aspect of capital, and the very act of lending capital itself justifies interest. Madhudi discredited this claim by pointing out the necessity of other factors like labor along with the capital for generation of the profit. Even so, profitability is not guaranteed in any entrepreneurship. Finally, interest is justified on the ground of time value of money. That is, money at present has more value than in future due to its potential of profitability. Hence, the lender charges for the decrease in the value of money for that period. The reasons for the decline are future is uncertain, present needs are more valuable, and money has higher practical utility in the present. Madhudi perceived this not as a concrete economic phenomenon, but rather as a mere psychological assumption. So I argue that the major point Madhudi missed out here is not just the phenomenon of inflation in the modern economy, but also the role of interest in inducing inflation by increasing the production cost. He recognizes it in other parts, but he's not actually getting into it. Also, he is from a journalistic background. Actually, in Islamic thought, Ibn Qayyim long back identified this potential interest potential for inflation, but Madhudi might be not aware of it. Critique on the theories of interest rates. So besides critiquing the justification of interest, Madhudi challenged the rationale of interest rate in classical economics. The determination of interest rate by applying the logic of demand and supply of capital for investment will only end up in economic depression. This system is based on speculation, in which the lender speculates both high rate of profit, whereas the borrower speculates both profit and loss. The system therefore operates on a continuous rivalry between two groups. Economically, along with the rise in the demand for capital in the economy, the lender increases the interest rate to the extent that business will no longer be profitable to the entrepreneur. At this stage, the demand decreases and the economy becomes stagnant, and the lender reduces interest rates to revitalize the economy. This continuous cycle will ultimately result in recurring depression in the capitalist economy. This actually is borrowing a little bit from Marxian, this recurring cycle of depression under capitalism and all. So Madhudi writes, the damage caused is exactly similar to the damage caused by the owner of a river who releases the blocks of water to the field and gardens according to the demand for the water. In his policy is that when there is no demand for water, he releases large quantities at low price. And as soon as the demand for water starts increasing, he begins to increase its price to the extent that it would not become profitable to buy water at such a price and use it in gardens and fields. So a cooperative relationship between capital and business based on profit and loss sharing would have avoided this instability in the economy. Another rationale for interest rates is focused on the capitalist need for the capital. Here, capitalist means the money, capitalist, the lender. If the capitalist is in need of his own resources, they increase the interest rate and decrease it if they don't need it. Madhudi refutes this by pointing out that only a marginal share of total capital is being utilized for individual demands. Capitalists hoards the money to reap maximum advantage of the changing economic circumstances. Then Madhudi is critiquing on the arguments that are being raised as advantages of interest. The claims of the economic benefits of interest, that is, motivation for saving and ensuring a continuous flow of financial capital to the best enterprises in the economy, and facilitation of credit needs, were outrightly rejected by Madhudi. In his view, interest prompts the hoarding and underutilization of wealth. The decreased consumption leads to a reduction in sales. The subsequent decline in production and employment results in reduced purchasing power among the masses. The excess production, coupled with reduced purchasing power, ends up in economic crisis. Besides, interest necessitates the flow of capital only into those industries that can fetch profit above the estimated fixed interest rate, thereby neglecting the diverse economic needs of the society. Furthermore, the interest forces the entrepreneur to maintain profit through whatever means possible. Referring to the long history of Muslim communities, Maududi argued that financing without interest is possible. However, since interest is legitimized in modern times, no one, including the government, can access loans without interest. Then he's getting into the critique on the forms of interest-based loans. So Maududi specifically elucidated the ill effects of interest in all forms of loans. In case of personal loans, there is a high possibility, particularly among economically marginalized sections, of getting trapped in the clutches of interest and being pushed into the perpetual economic indebtedness. The ceaseless anxiety arising out of this scenario will not only reduce the work capacity, but also force them into antisocial activities like crime. The consequent reduction in the productivity of labor and purchasing power of the debtor will hit commerce, ultimately ending up in economic depression. On commercial loans, Maududi rebuked the moneylenders since they are the only class having the privilege of fixed profit indifferent to the realities of the market. More than that, the lender hoards capital to attain maximum benefit of the fluctuations in the financial market and invests capital only in enterprises in which the profit is completely assured. This short-term investment will foster mediocre business and hinder enterprises catering to the public interest. In long-term investments, devaluation of currency necessitates the entrepreneur to increase the sales to maintain high profit margin. If that is not achieved, the business will fall into loss. Regarding public debts, the government amasses from the capitalists within the nation. The inevitability of interest payment necessitates the government to extract wealth in the form of taxes. The entrepreneurial class, to maintain the profitability amidst increased taxes and other levies, increase the price of goods. See, here Maududi recognizes how interest lead to inflation, but this is not being further developed. The transfer of taxed money to the capitalists in the form of interest is indeed an indirect exchange of wealth from the poor to the rich within the country via the medium of government. And he states that, and he sarcastically writes down, in this upside down system, the biggest capitalist of the country becomes the most deserving person to receive help. And the obligation to help these deserving capitalists rests on the shoulders of every citizen of the country who is obliged to toil hard with his sweat and blood, even if it is at the cost of providing bread and butter to his starving children. A portion of that food is thus reserved and procured for country's most poor billionaire. More critical than this, the sovereign debts will disturb the autonomous monetary and economic status of the indebted nations. Subsequent financial constraints of the nation engender extremist political, cultural, and economic ideologies leading to wars or revolution. Because he was writing in that context after First World War and everything, he observed that. So that also went into his writings. Apart from this, Maududi engaged in in-depth critique of interest in various spheres of life. Morally, interest will breed negative characteristics like selfishness and materialism, and this will create a social situation in which the need of one individual will be perceived as an opportunity by the other. This perennial antagonistic relation between the lender and the borrower, according to Maududi, will beget social and cultural deterioration, eventually leading to economic deterioration as well. Due to time constraints, I'm skipping the critique on the history of modern banking. He's basically looking into the history of banking, in how the banking emerged from goldsmiths, how they issued receipts for the gold, and then it started paper currency. And he's critiquing that because according to him, the entire banking system is founded on without any actual capital base. So I'm critiquing, I'm skipping that session. Coming to the conclusion. Despite being an Islamic scholar, political philosopher, and an activist, why Maududi spent so many years on interest? The answer lies in the key aspect he identifies of Islamic moral economy, that is the circulation of wealth. Four basic elements of Islamic economy, according to Maududi, are free economy without restrictions, zakat, which is compulsory taxation, the law of inheritance, and the prohibition of interest. Adherence to these will bring the circulation of wealth without compromising on economic prosperity. Among these, only the prohibition of interest was under severe attack in modernity. Maududi identified interest as an essential element of capitalism to the extent that capitalism will collapse without interest. Maududi illustrates the impact of capitalist economy as initially, capitalist wealth, with its fabulous display, created deceptive scintillation in civilization. But the end result of this unequal distribution of wealth is metaphorically nothing more than frozen blood supply within the body of global economy. Most parts of the body dry up and die for the want of blood, and the excessive accumulation of blood destroys the vital organs of the body. Maududi explored the possibility of communist alternative to capitalism, but abandoned it as unnatural due to its denial of the pursuit of human self-interest. Basically, they were looking at, whenever Islamic thinkers, when they are engaging with communism, they are looking into the communist regimes and communist governments, not exactly to the Marxian critique per se. For him, the communist regime is autocratic and run by the big capitalists in power. In the search for perfect economic alternative, Maududi ended up with Islam, which he identified as a balanced economic system, antithetical to the two extremes of capitalism and communism. So I argue that responding to the major economic questions in his period might have influenced Maududi to perceive Islam as a balanced system. In conjunction with the conceptualization of Islamic economic system, Maududi formulated its comprehensive structure and identified interest prohibition as one of the four fundamentals of the system. Citing no other sin in Islam has been proclaimed as harshly as interest, he constructed the real objective of interest prohibition as the annihilation of capitalism. Consequently, constructing interest-free finance is incommensurable under capitalist economic system. However, in a reality where Islamic economic system is shattered and capitalism engulfed the modern economy practically and ideologically, Maududi recognized that interest as a normal practice has been ingrained into the psyche of Muslim common sense. Basically, he was writing this for those Muslims, not exactly for the academia. So he ventured to construct a general framework for the interest-free Islamic economic system. Hence, the negation of interest provided a crucial philosophical and practical foundation for imagining an alternative Islamic economy, and the conceptual categories Maududi developed aided the development of Islamic economics as a distinct discipline in the later years. Maududi's attempt to understand the rationale of interest prohibition is not at all a novel development in Islamic thought. For instance, much before the advent of modern economics, Ibn Qayyim astutely predicted the inflationary potential of interest. The significance of Maududi stems from the fact that he contributed to sustain the relevance of the critical discourse on interest in a period where interest is completely normalized. More so, it paved way for imagining and developing alternating ways of finance in the peripheries of the mainstream economy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sana, for a wonderful, in fact, angle, which is because most of the times when you look at the standard text dealing with history of economic thought, the entire Islamist approach is limited to moral critique of interest. However, most of them recognize the property aspect of it, because for the first time, gender aspect was more equal than any other religious doctrine than in Islam, which made Islam in that sense very progressive at the outset. But those things were recognized. But the way Madudi's contribution is there, it's very important because it can be seen the totality. Because while on the one hand it talks about the demand side of the impact, on the other hand it also talks about the control of the control over the resources and basically monopolization of the lending market itself. And further, that is also very important that it also talks about banking system and leverage also. The idea of leverage is also there, how it can be used, like, okay, you only a part of it is under transactions and valuations. So leverage is that. So those concepts are quite well and I think wonderfully discussed in your paper. But I have a few queries. You have already talked about that he to some extent ignored inflation, even if at some point of time he gave a passing reference to that, but largely it remained absent in terms of analysis. But what is more important, in fact, what I see that the money as an asset, so cash or maybe money as an asset, that is very important because inflation is also a part of it. When you have money in your hand, you can buy equity, bonds, invest in commodities, okay, the different kind of things. Inflation is also in that way a kind of purchasing power of money. So it's not about simply keeping money for the next period. So what is more important, that different uses of money. Okay. So in that sense, if let us suppose there is no interest rate, if your money is not yielding anything, in fact, many say that money is sterile, money cannot produce money. But what happens in that case, if others' assets, money as an asset is yielding other things, yielding something positive, in across all other aspects, then definitely no one will hold cash or money. In fact, entire economy will witness complete wiping out of money for the lending purposes. Are you getting my point? So nobody would lend it out. So relative yield of money is also important, that including the cash. So how would you highlight that firstly? And secondly, when we talk about, when we link interest rate to profit and all, as Madhudi actually done, that okay, it's risky about risk, profit and loss and all. But what, if we look at the origin of rate of interest in mainstream economics, it was started with mainly William Nassau Senior, who had an abstinence theory of interest rate, who talked about like, why you charge interest rate, because you abstain from the consumption. Consumption is good. You are abstaining from the consumption. Therefore, something is charged upon that. And later, and in fact, that pain must be rewarded with the interest rate. But what is important with that notion is, for the first time, capital or loanable funds became a factor of production. Because earlier, when you talk about before Nassau, there was no distinction between profit and interest rate. So in most of the writings of Adam Smith, Ricardo, and all classical economics, they were totally confused about profit and rate of interest. Okay, they were basically treated them similarly. But William Nassau Senior's, after that, post his analysis, the interest rate was treated as factor of production. Now, interest, as far as we talk about risk, so now there were three kind of factor of production. One, of course, labor was there, land was there, so capital was there. So interest was something which is a fixed. Okay, The
Mhm.
owner who is taking that loan has to have returned the money with certain interest rate. An entire risk is basically owned by entrepreneur. So risk is associated with the entrepreneur. Okay. In money, loanable money will fetch a fixed interest rate. Labor class will ask for a fixed wage rate. Land also would fetch a fixed rent before you conduct any economic exercise. So they will charge a fixed rate before you enter into a production. So whatever production is happening, whatever risk is associated with the production is basically accrued to the one who is owning that activity, entrepreneur. So risk is associated with them, but capital is taking a fixed return, labor is getting a fixed return. So there is no risk associated with that. So basically, creating a divide between capital and ownership of economic activity was very essential to it. So I want you to start with the commenting on these two things, and let's take questions from the audience in between.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, sir. So those were very insightful questions. So the major limitation of this paper is that the paper only engaged with how Maududi handled interest. But then the point is that Maududi's engagement with interest is part of his engagement with this larger idea of Islamic economy. So moment you place the Islamic interest as part of that whole, all these problems won't come up. The problems that we see in the capitalist economy, that won't come up in the Islamic economy. So it's also moral economy, right? So the entire foundation itself is different. The entire foundation, the entire logic in which people operate, it's not exactly the way of a rational individual operates. For instance, according to in Islam, there is a rule that if a person has money, wealth, other than, has savings, and if the another person demands it, and it's legally, it should be lent out, and it's a necessity. And then the reward for lending money to a person in need is more rewarded than charity itself. So there are all these notions working out that enables that entire Islamic economy. There is zakat system is there. Also there is Baitul Mal is there. So within that, when we put these restrictions of interest, then the system works. That's why the major reason why Islamic finance had to amend with too many capitalist things, because they are working under capitalist premises. That aspect is there. Yeah, so I think both questions are coming from that aspect. So if we understand it in a holistic way, this will be. Also, Maududi recognized these problems. And he says that it can't be achieved within it. It can never happen within it unless we completely change it. So, and he's not only asking for individual moral changes, he's demanding the change from the state itself. So he's basically a political philosopher, and his ideas are a bit controversial. But the thing is that he first the state has to intervene in it, then the entire society need to be restructured in a different way. Then only this will operate, or else this will also be a failure. Or else, yeah, that's the.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so basically, it's more about personal loans. Maybe I will come back to you later if we have time, if we get the time. But there are a few questions from the audience as well.
Yeah.
Like, how does Islam ensure macroeconomic stability from the government perspective, of course, without using interest rates? So basically, you use interest rates as a tool to stabilize the economy. So I think that question is asked in that respect. Could you suggest any literature regarding this?
Yeah. So the problem of stability won't arise according to Maududi. The thing is that there is a difference between the real economy and monetary economy in our present system. But in Islam, the way he perceives it is completely different. For instance, when an entrepreneur lends it, they have to be much connected with each other. For instance, when I'm investing in something, I have to check its profitability. And then there should be a lot of trust. I missed this factor. Trust is an important element in Islamic way of doing things. So there should be much more trust and reliability between the parties. So there is not great difference between the real economy, what's happening out there, and the money economy. So because there is not much difference between the two, then there won't be instabilities. Actually, it actually happened when the 2008 depression hit. It didn't hit the Islamic banking system because it was more connected with the real economy.
Okay. Interesting point. So is Madhudi, I'm talking about a second question. Is Madhudi talking about interest per se, or in his book Riba, positioned in the role of government in fostering economic development, in which he puts larger emphasis on zakat, obligatory tax that is collected by state and then used in redistribution of resources?
Now let me read it one more time.
Yeah, it's basically. So do you see that in the zakat's context?
See, zakat and the prohibition of interest are two complementary aspects. So this work, see why he focuses more on interest is specifically because of the context. The context in which a lot of Muslim scholars started coming and saying that, see, interest is fine. So he had to respond to that situation as, no, it's not. So it's also a colonial context. And there is an idea among many intelligentsia that wealth and power are necessary to gain back, to strengthen the community. Moment you take wealth and power are necessary, then you take whatever route is available to attain wealth and power. Then it requires compromising the Sharia, the existing rules. In that context, Madhudi is intervening. So this specific work it actually published as a book much later on, but he started writing on interest from early on itself. In fact, his first work was on interest. So yeah, to the question, zakat, in this work, he's specifically engaging with interest, but he's also he's also engaging with the question of zakat, and he's saying that, see, the public insurance that we have, there won't be any need of a insurance companies or systems if we properly execute the rules of zakat in the country. But it's much more difficult than that said. But then he is envisioning, he is giving the framework in that way, in the frame of zakat. But zakat is not much discussed primarily because zakat was not under attack. Prohibition of interest was under attack, so he engaged more with interest.
Okay, so there are, I guess, right now no questions, but I have a couple of, yes.
Actually, Avninder, yeah, may I come in here? May I just ask a question
Sure.
that I'm actually quite intrigued by while listening to Shahana, and but you can go forward if you want.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So I find this very interesting also. I mean, of course, and in fact, I'm taking off from Abninder's point that he was mentioning earlier, that he's saying that typically when we read of Islamic economics, it's thought of as being, like interest is denigrated in that sense. And here, Maududi is attempting a rationalization of interest. So in that sense, it's interesting that what is it that distinguishes him within the larger Islamic economic thought pantheon in that regard? And is he trying to make some sort of a reconciliation between, say, Islamic economics and capitalism of sorts? Like, is it a kind of acceptance of that? Or, I'm just interested in the context. What makes him rationalize it in this sense? Yeah.
Yeah. So what is happening actually on ground was that there were in Aligarh and all, there were a lot of Muslims being taught up in modern education. And then they started critiquing Islam and the laws of Islam. So when they see the law that interest is being prohibited in Islam, it doesn't make sense to them because they are thinking from the capitalist perspective. So addressing those masses, the recently modernized Muslims, he's writing this book for them. So to address to them, he's giving all these rational justifications why interest should be prohibited. Also, this is not exactly a new development in the Islamic thought. Earlier also, thinkers attempted to understand why interest is prohibited. But in modern times, his was quite seminal contribution. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess Maria is having a question. So
Hi.
Yeah, I heard Charmin ask a question. I thought I can do that too then. I thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And I agree here with the comments already made that you're giving a new perspective to this history and to this thinker, which I think is really important. And I wanted to pick up on one of the newer perspectives I feel like you found in your research on this specific quote that you mentioned towards the end of the presentation on the capital being blood and how if it's not distributed equally around the body. And this is just fascinating stuff because lots of thinkers are doing this in the 19th century, right? And I mean, I'm like imagining a history of biological metaphors where we haven't looked before, right? I think this is really fascinating. I think we should continue talking about this. I think this could be a really interesting kind of similarities that we see with a lot of thinkers all over the world at this time. And there's lots of really great research talking about how that changes the way they conceptualize and think about the economy, and then what they think then is a good idea to do in the economy, right? Because this, talking about organs and how sectors of the economy are like organs of the body, and blood was a very, very important idea in economic theory around this time. So I just want to say this is just fascinating, really, really interesting stuff. And I guess my question is, how did you interpret this quote in terms of the link between the economy being a body? How do you see that impacting his thought?
Yeah. So this idea of holistic, looking economy holistically instead of class antagonisms is something that differentiate Islamic thought from Marxian thought. And that's one thing, Maududi actually draws a lot of, this idea of whenever he attempts to critique capitalism, he uses Marxian critique. But then, then later on getting into distinguish from Marxism, saying that Islam is much more holistic. And this is also coming from that theological concept that everyone is God's creation. So God's creation should live in coherence and everything. So that's there in the back. So with that, that's why imagining it in a holistic way. Also, it's not completely it's not completely a modern phenomena, because there is a line in Quran which clearly states that the wealth should get circulated among you. You shouldn't hoard wealth, and wealth shouldn't be kept among few among you. Wealth should get circulated. So he can refer into those Quranic lines and all, but also of course, he's a modern thinker, and when we look into his career, he was more a journalist. He had some education in classical Islam and everything, but he was quite exposed to all other modern aspects. That's reflected in his work as well. Also, he has little detached from other Islamic thinkers at that period.
okay, very nice. But again, I have one query. How, because when he was writing, definitely commercial banks were quite developed. This was a time when not only in the Western, but also in India, it was quite operating at a large scale. So how in Madudi's, because if you are talking about interest rate provision and all, how in Madudi's writing, the commercial banks were placed at that one. Has you written something on commercial banks? Because you talk about individual lending, okay, individual lending. You are talking about it's better to give like zakat and others. Money cannot yield money and all. But what about the commercial systems?
Okay.
Has he? Yeah.
Yes, he did that. Actually, he provided a complete framework how to reorganize the banking, reorganize the state and everything. When I said about zakat, in India, Muslims are, how zakat is being distributed is individually people doing it. But he was envisioning a zakat system as a larger way in which state collects everything and state distribute whoever is in need. So no one need to be worried about it. So yeah, commercial banks also he makes multiple options, like those who just want to save and secure money, they need to pay little service tax, and then those who want to invest in it, and then let there be connection between, let that be in a partnership basis. Mushar, for instance, if that, there should be contact with the entrepreneur and the investor, or else the bank should take the responsibility and clearly monitor it so that there won't be a cheating. Also, if the loss happen, it shouldn't completely fall onto the entrepreneur. There is a contract in Islam, which is that two parties can enter into a party. One is providing the labor and the other is providing the capital. So when the loss happens, it will fall completely on those who invested it, because he is lost his labor in it. So he was basing it on that contractual. There are a lot of contractual aspects which already existed in Islamic thought. But when we look into modern Islamic finance, this actually didn't take up much.
Okay, thank you, Sana. Wonderful, because it actually, bring up larger questions like, okay, if output is a collaborative project like land, labor, and capital, why at certain point of time in a feudal history, it was owned by a landed class of feudals, and in a capitalist world, it is owned by the capitalist class. So why all factor of productions are not having things on control over the surplus on a shared basis? And if it was on the shared basis, some, Adam Smith started with that. Even Ricardo, to some extent, said that, but there was no system of, justice, or maybe there was no system on which the total output could be distributed, and it totally, totally departure in the mainstream discourse. So that's a very large question. In fact, time is already over. Thank you very much, Sana. Thank you. It was a very important and insightful talk. And over to Sharmin.
1 second. Yeah, so firstly, thank you, Shahana, for that wonderful presentation. And I think bringing up very different set of issues from, the kind of discussions we've been having today. And also thank you, Avninder, for your comments and questions. All of that made for a very interesting conversation as such. So now we move on to our last presentation for the day, which is being delivered by Maria Bach. Maria is a postdoctoral researcher at the Walrus Pareto Center, University of Lausanne in Switzerland. She is an historian of economics, interested in how economists from what we call the global south today, how they produced economic ideas. Maria completed a PhD at King's College London in international political economy on the first generation of modern Indian economists. In fact, her PhD's work is interesting. It's on Ranade Nauroji and Gopal Krishna Gokhale. I don't know, you can correct me if I got that wrong, Maria. Then, lastly, Maria has a forthcoming book, which is titled Relocating Development Economics, the First Generation of Modern Indian Economists, which is being published by Cambridge University Press. So yeah, we are looking forward to seeing that book soon. And so with that, I hand over to Maria for her presentation on emancipatory national accounting, a comparison between India and America.
Yes, thank you, Sharmin, for that wonderful introduction. And indeed, yeah, my thesis was on Nauroji, Ranade, and Dutt, Ramachandra Dutt.
Oh, yes,
and then
my mistake.
Yeah. Yeah, no. The book includes Gokhale as well. So, because the book looks at the bigger, the first generation. I mean, these 9 economists that were that lived in the 19th century, more so in the second half of the 19th century. So it was not wrong per se, because I have looked at him as well. And it's coming out in November, fingers crossed now. I'm very excited. And hopefully I'll be bringing it to India very soon. So thank you so much for the invitation. I want to just take a second to congratulate all the organizers who've put this together so quickly and so wonderfully. So thank you. I had lots of colleagues this week congratulate me as if I had anything to do with it, but about the great program and so on. So this is really wonderful to be here. I'm going to share my screen so I can get my slides up. Not that they're that important, my slides, but they're pretty, so you know, it helps with engagement, hopefully. So I will start. So in the late 1860s, there were two economists, one in India and the other in North America, who produced a national income estimate. The Indian economist Dabadan Naruji produced India's first ever national income estimate for years 1867 to 1868, based on production data, primarily agricultural production. Some thousands of miles away, an North American economist, Ezra Seaman, worked out one of the first estimates for national income from income tax data for 1866, and a figure for domestic production for 1869. So although on different continents with drastically different circumstances, both Naruji and Seaman argue that if we could measure the size of their economies, they could understand their own progress. This statement, of course, seems very evident today with economic measurements like the gross domestic product that are printed daily in widespread media and publications. But the practice of measuring our economy, of course, had only just begun in the 1800s. Some even argue that counting the size of our economies really began in the 1930s and 1940s in North America. So my idea here in this bigger project that I have, that I've only just started, is that it's important to look at this earlier time period in national accounting, because as much as we can say that these national income estimates in the second half of the 19th century look very different to what we had later, they called them national income estimates, right? They discussed them as we are counting the size of our production in order to understand our progress. Well, that's exactly what the inventors of the GDP said in the 1930s. So all that to say that this history that I'm trying to do is trying to say that, look, we started counting the size of our economies much, much earlier. And that's the one thing. And the second thing is that I'm looking elsewhere. And not that nobody has looked at national accounting in what we call the Global South today, but there we really only look at how colonizers have counted their own colonies. So you know, you have Phyllis Dean from Britain, who counts a couple of different African economies in kind of the 1940s, 1950s, and she comes up with a whole book about social accounting or what she calls colonial social accounting, and then other historians have looked at earlier time periods of how the colonizers used this national accounting, right, to count the size of economies as a way to control the population, of course, because you could understand how many farmers there were, for example, and how much yield they had, so you could understand how much you could tax them, and then you could argue that, you know, colonization brings us X amount of pounds or X amount of money. But when my gaze is obviously on different kinds of people, different kinds of producers of knowledge, i.e. people that have that are from these colonies or former colonies, that have basically a much more extensive experience of these economies. And what I'm finding already, although I'm very much at the beginning of this project, is that they actually started to use this national accounting as an emancipatory tool. Hence my title here, Emancipatory National Accounting, is because all of a sudden they're saying, hey, we're here, we can actually count our own economies, and we can use these numbers, just like the colonizers do, in order to prove political or economic theories, right? Or you know, we can prove that a political intervention is good. We can say, look, economically, we're in this state, etc. Right. Wonderful. So as I said, this is part of a much bigger project that I've just started that looks at the history of national accounting in the global, what we call the Global South today. So the idea is to understand how people from colonies or former colonies count their own economies in order to add to the bigger literature of history of national accounting. And as I said, I think it's gonna bring us new perspectives on how national accounting is done, how national accounting is done in different circumstances. Because at least this is how I do history of economics. There are lots of ways of doing it, but the way I do history of economics is to understand the link between context and what knowledge is produced. And so this is just one case study out of a few others that I have. I look at Argentina in this period and a little bit later as well in the 20th century. I also look at Nigeria in the 1960s. And the idea is that there are different instances of countries that are colonies. So here we have India, who's colonized, right? We have North America, who had been colonized, but was obviously independent in this period, very much so independent. And then Argentina had also been independent for a long time. And then we have in Nigeria in the 1960s, who really does, there's this Nigerian economist who works for the government, who produces a national account in 1962, and they've only been independent for 2 years, right? And what I'm trying to tease out there is to understand how the different power relations affect the knowledge production here, and knowledge production here being how you count an economy, right? How accounting has been done. And the idea for this particular paper was that I was invited by a group of historians of North America, and they wanted other perspectives as well from other parts of the world. And so I thought, and there are about 3 or 4 economists in the 19th century in North America that are using census data, right? Because they already had census data by this point to produce the size of their economies. And so I thought perhaps quite interesting to compare the two countries, because as much, again, they're very different circumstances, right? North America is independent, and of course India isn't. They're just starting their nationalist movement, but it's a large territory. It's made up of lots of states, right, with lots of different ways of doing things, and they're also trying to produce a country, right? Hence the kind of emancipatory, the word emancipation again, right? Because in the 1960s, of course, as everybody knows, we have the American Civil War. And so the national accounting there is also used as an emancipatory tool. And Ezra Seaman is an interesting example in a way, because he does count at this very same period as Nehruji, as opposed to the others, which is why I chose him, but also because he's not really talked about at all. There are a few books about the history of statistics and history of national accounting in the US at this point. One really excellent example is Eli Cook's book, but he doesn't even mention Ezra Seaman. He seems to have kind of been forgotten about. So hence my idea that I could dig up some stuff on him. So a little bit then more for people in the audience who might not know Nehruji, although I doubt that this is the case and nobody knows who is in this audience. But of course, Jawaharlal Nehruji is of course beginning the nationalist movement at this point. He's well educated both in India and in the UK, and he wants to prove Indian poverty, right? And it does this this calculation of the Indian economy to disprove what the British are saying, which is that India is a prosperous and rich country. And he says, no, that's not at all correct, right? That colonization is not bringing progress to India. And just quickly on the comparisons between the two, and then I'm going to go a little bit more in detail onto what Nehruji and Seaman did for the national accounts, is that they're both talking about transport, railways, not at all services. It's a lot about agricultural production, which I think makes sense in the context, of course. They talk a lot about price fluctuations, which I think will be one of the things that I'm going to concentrate on in this paper, because it's really interesting, because they have lots of knowledge about how prices fluctuate in their own economies, and understand that it depends on the area, etc. And so you can't take averages of prices in large countries like the United States and India. They also talk about double counting, which again, this is something we know a lot about today, because that's something that was taken up when they established and invented the gross domestic product. But this is kind of a new, it's a bit newer in this period. And then they both interestingly talk about minimum wants, so very differently. So when Nehru was calculating his national income estimate, he wanted to prove poverty, as I said. And so what he did was he both calculated the size of the Indian economy, so a national income estimate per capita, but then he also worked out cost of living per capita using data from how much the British spent on inmates in prisons, which is something that was done elsewhere in the world at the time. So he was not the only one that took that as because that could seem quite controversial today, but that was the only statistics. Those are the only statistics he could find, right? And this cost of living index then was much, much higher than the actual income. So he's saying, okay, well, then it was poor. Seaman, on the other hand, wanted to figure out the minimum wants or the kind of minimum demands of people because he feared overproduction to do with prices. Because if the US overproduced and didn't have the demand either through exporting the goods or selling them in their domestic market, then of course prices would decrease, and then you would have a decrease in progress. So it's interesting that they have that. They both want to figure out what minimum wants are, but for very different reasons. Again, kind of, I'm starting to want to do a lot more of this comparison across the world because I think it's really fascinating when you compare. You can tease out reasons why people say X and not Y because of the different contexts. It's kind of to tease out that how context affects how we produce knowledge. Okay, let me move on quickly so I don't take too much time. Of course, in the late 19th century, India is starting to experience ever more severe famines, right? So Dabadan Ruji, as well as the other economists in India at the time, are seeing poverty around them, right? In the 1960s, as I said, too, of course, you have the American Civil War, which at first kind of increases the price of cotton in India because means that people are demanding, or the global market is demanding more of Indian cotton, but it plummets right after the price of cotton starts to plummet after the American Civil War. This is all just to say that there's a context, of course, a regional context, but there's also this international context that affects the Indian economy drastically, not just because it's a colony, but because it's a huge producer of raw materials, right, for the industrialization that's happening across parts of the world at the time. And as I said, the Nehruji found it really important to prove Indian poverty because the British had started publishing these reports on an annual basis called Moral and Material Progress. I think the first one was published in 1861 in order to prove that India was morally and materially progressing. And of course, this is all a part of the civilizing mission, right? That the British had to prove that they were there for a reason and so on. And they had all these statistics, and Nehruji got access to all these reports in a library in London in the 1850s and 60s. And he read, of course, the data quite differently, right? As one would, right? Not coming from the same situation, not with the same goal, etc. And he said, look, you read these reports, and what they're just doing, the Brits, Nehruji says, and this is word for word almost, is that they're taking data and putting it into their theory, right? So they already have the theory, and then they put in the data that they have in order to prove their theory, which is that India is becoming richer, right? Right. Okay. So he does several little calculations. The first one that comes out in 1870 is really the kind of a large guesstimate. Really, he takes total production divided by population, and he uses tax income data at that point, right, and kind of extrapolates from that. Later on, he does another calculation in 1873 and 1876, which is a little bit more sophisticated. And I won't have time to go into the details here. I kind of wanted to give you more of a understanding of the context and how I'm trying to link that context with the details of how he counts. And like lots of economists of the time, he does not take services as something that gives wealth, right? And he doesn't even take transport for two reasons. A, because it's just transports a good from A to B, a lot like the physiocrats in France, right? It's just the idea that, well, it's not actually producing wealth just by distributing something from A to B. But also because, of course, the railways were owned by predominantly British, but also other Europeans, right? And so the profits weren't even staying in India. Okay, I'm gonna have to move on. No, perhaps just one thing before I move on, which is really interesting. The colonial, as I said, the imperial administration, as I say here on the slide, the imperial administration, of course, were very unhappy with his 20 rupee per capita national income, because that obviously then disproved these reports on moral and material progress that, and it really shocked the London public when he presented this in London in 1870, right? They just assumed that India was really, really rich. They were seeing lots of rich Indians coming to them, and they were like, but this can't be possible. And so the imperial administration then retaliated and did their own calculations, which those calculations I think are lost. I've been trying to look for them, but they were never published. And for now no one's found the calculations. And that came out to 27 rupees, which is still very low, right? And one of the things that Nehruji says that they missed, the imperial administration, was that they didn't take the differences in yield between unirrigated and irrigated land, right? So, and that's just one of many examples of where Nehruji goes much more into the details than the imperial administration. Okay, so quickly on Ezra Seaman, who I said, there's not much information on him. I haven't even been able to find a picture of him. As you see here, this is just the book here, which he published several editions. I think there were about 7 of them between 1846 and 1868. And it's very detailed on kind of what brings progress. And then at the very end, he gives us his calculations on national income per capita, which comes out to $70 in 1852, for example. And of course, just quickly on the context in the US, is that there are lots of people, or there are at least 3 or 4 doing these kinds of national income estimates. And the idea is that all of a sudden humans are seen as these as capital, right? That they're capital inputs plugged into economic equations. And I'm sure that this is, North America is not the only place where this is happening. And so Seaman is one of these. And he actually works for the government at one point in the kind of statistics department, right? Trying to figure out what to count agricultural production and so on. And one of the things that a bit like Nehruji, right? He produced this as a critique, and he was critiquing free trade that he thought was too dominant, like this idea that free trade was a good idea. He argued that they needed statistics in political economy in order to really understand what are the kind of laws of nature in political economy and so on, and not just make them up kind of thing. And so he thought it was really interesting. He thought it was really necessary to have statistics in order to understand political economy better, with this overall arching goal, which is very clear in this book from the get-go, that he wanted to prove that protectionism was the way to go. Okay, I'm going to go to the next slide, because I think I may have already gone over my time, so I'm just going to take as little time as I can. Now, this kind of the preliminary conclusions I have so far, right? The idea is that, of course, Nehruji was part of the kind of the beginning, kind of the instigator of the nationalist movement and so on, and so he was trying to use these statistics to prove that the colonizers were doing harm to India and not the opposite. But of course, and I think this was probably more indirect and something it's much easier for me to see as an historian. I mean, he was also proving quite vividly that Indians could count their own economies, right? They didn't need some foreigners to do it for them, right? Which, again, this emancipatory role that I think national accounting had in this context. And finally, and this is something I see in the other case studies, right? The idea is that if you count your economy, well, you're placing a border around a territory, right? Which they didn't have technically, right? If they're a colony, then their border is not their country, right? And so just by the act of counting your own economy means that you are proving that you can become an independent country, right? And then you can start to be compared to other countries and so on. And he has this table where he has he gets statistics from other statisticians like Mulhall and Atkinson of other countries' national income estimates, and he puts India at the very bottom, right? Because India, according to him, right, is the poorest country in the world. And one last point, right? Overall, I'm trying to add to the bigger literature of like statistics can never be objective, right? The very act of deciding what to count is subjective, right? And so it's interesting that when you have someone else with another goal, then the act of counting is different. And these numbers obviously have political power, and that's what Nehruji understood so well. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, and please excuse the background noise. But yes. But anyway, let me give some comments to Maria's paper till then. Now, firstly, thanks a lot, Maria. That was a very interesting presentation and an interesting kind of comparison to draw, one from, India, of course, being a colony, and the other, America, on the other hand, former colony, I guess, by then, but kind of still in the task of, proving its nationhood in that sense, creating the nation in a sense. So in that sense, the titling of your paper, the emancipatory, potential of national accounting, becomes very interesting. And in this sense, I'd also like to point out that my comments and my questions are not really technical in nature, as in they're not going to go into the details of the accounting and statistics, but rather my comments and questions are going to be more conceptual in nature. So just drawing from some of the historians that and sociologists that I have been reading, who are writing around this idea of the national economy and the emergence of the idea of a national economy as such. So and in fact, I think as you, as you're also familiar, right, with the works of, and these are just the relations I'm drawing, and I would be also happy to hear from like other questions from the audience about the around these things. But if we look at, say, the works of also Goswami, that's Manu Goswami on Producing India, and Satish Deshpande on the imagined economy, in that sense, it's very interesting how scholars are bringing about that towards this late 19th century, we and this is of course in the case of India especially, the discovery of the economy, or the discovery of the national economy as such, and the discovery of the economy, and therefore through the economic form, giving a sense to the it enables, in a sense, a conceptualization of the nation as well. And the thing is that here, the nation and the economy together are being discovered through poverty and through economic exploitation, rather. So that is actually the language, the vocabulary through which the national economy comes to be constructed. More rather, and of course from there, so therefore national accounting, or the per capita income that Navroji then calculates and all, is actually, as you had said, it is about, you have to give the territory where what you're counting has to be delimited territorially. So that's an interesting point to think about, and I wonder, and also in the case, most Indian histories have also mentioned that, that among the earliest, most systematic kind of articulations of Indian nationalism were, in that sense, through talking about the economic exploitation. Of course, there were also the cultural variants to it, and the cultural political aspects to it, and the language of social reform. All of that was part of nationalism in India, but this economic form was what really kind of put a force behind it, and at least for the mainstream of the nationalist movement, the economic aspect was really foregrounded as opposed to some of the more important social questions. So that actually is a very interesting part, and it's interesting. It might be useful to also consider how a thing like national accounting plays into that. You know, the whole act of counting, creating a sense of the population, the people, data, information in that kind of a sense is, I mean, these are things that kind of are all coming to my mind as I'm, listening to this and reading your paper. And the other question I have is, again, I mean, I just hope in terms of even the audience and, familiarity with different kind of texts and all, but I was also wondering about Timothy Mitchell's writing on the rule of experts, and which is often quoted as Timothy Mitchell distinctly says that the national economy, as we understand it today, the way we count it, we think of it as a manageable, quantifiable object, right? And especially the management part of it. He's saying that Mitchell's assertion is that it's largely the 1930s when you can actually tangibly construct, at least you get the idea of the national economy. And he says it's more through the writings of someone like Keynes, once he comes up, especially with writing about the general theory. And it's actually the first major way to clearly construct a way of managing the national economy as such. Well, so something like 19th century national accounting, the kind of history you're constructing, and even what I think about, because the way we talk about and some of the historians we read are talking about a sense of a national economy towards the 19th century. Of course, Timothy Mitchell also addresses that to some extent, but he clearly says that the kind of writings, that Friedrich List and the way he's conceptualizing the national economic system is not truly national economy in the 20th century sense. And he also kind of contradicts the Polanyi, because even Polanyi is talking about that sense of, creating the notion of the self-regulating society and economy and all. So I wonder how these kind of accounts would compare to that we are saying that there is a national economy as a clearly identifiable object. So it's just something I'm thinking, and maybe even you can you can comment upon that. So yeah, I mean, for now, I think I can put it upon that. And I also like that, yes, and to put it as a last thing, I found that thing interesting, that what you said, the gaze is upon the different producers of knowledge, so coming from more the global south, from the colonized context, and also interested that economic knowledge, in that sense, how is it produced? Counting becomes actually a very important part now of, it creates narratives in that sense. So yeah, I found that quite interesting. The political dimension of, of statistics and numbers. So yeah. So anyway, thanks. Thanks for your presentation, and we hope to get some more questions. And and also, I look forward to your response, Maria.
Yeah, thank you, Sharmin. We always have great things to say with our when I present in front of you. So thank you for this. I like this phrase, discovery of the national economy through poverty, because that then can get me closer to how then this is different national accounting on the part of Nehruji than Seaman, right? Because as much as he sees a lot of poverty in the South, he's from the North. And he sees there's obviously a lot of industrialization and so on in the North, although so there's lots of progress happening on the national level, but of course there's on inequalities that he worries about. But so yeah, really great phrase. And I and how counting, of course, forges the nation and so on. And I think Manu Goswami has done a fantastic job in this. Maybe I need to look at this imagined economy a little bit more. I've read that too, but I've used it a lot less. And that links to your second point and the kind of key question you have about well, what about people who say that this starts a lot later, right? But I think, at least this is what I'm trying to do, and I think that this is what Manu Goswami and the author of Imagined Economies as well proves, is that, well, it's actually happening much earlier than this. But what I need to do before I give kind of my take on it, what I need to do is I need to understand how kind of historians of North America sees this earlier history, right? Because as I said, Seaman is not the only one doing this. And I mean, Seaman published 7 variations of this book. This book is gigantic, right? I mean, it's someone told me last year when I was trying to find out more about him that it's actually kind of a book that's kind of boring to read, and it doesn't say much new than the others, and so maybe that's why it's been forgotten about. But that means that stuff is going on, and then yet, you know, historians of national accounting will essentially really only talk about the 1930s and 40s, Keynes and so on. And is it because so like I need to understand and talk to them a bit more about how they see this prehistory of GDP, because it is mentioned in Eli Cook's book. I forget the title now, but he talks about statistics in the 19th century and basically how they go from moral statistics, so, you know, number of poor people, and how many people are addicts. I think I don't know the details of the moral statistics, but basically, how do we go from moral statistics to counting the whole economy? And he says, well, industrialization makes humans become capital, and so we need to count them to understand how they produce, how they're productive or not productive, etc. And there's this turn, and I think it happens elsewhere in the world too. But so he thinks this prehistory is really, really important, right? But there aren't that many more texts on that, so I need to understand what they think about it. But I think my hunch is that people like Timothy Mitchell talks about this, the economy only really being produced in the 1930s, is perhaps because on an international level, although it's obviously in North America imposing a structure on the rest of the world, right? But anyway, that the world then accepts this, right? And just says, okay, so this is what we call an economy, right? This is what an economy is, and everybody's going to count the same way. And of course, it's not quite true that in practice that they do, but there's some kind of there's enough international collaboration or acceptance that this is now the way we're going to count this economy, and this means ABC. Well, it means that we can intervene in the economy this way, or it means we shouldn't intervene in the economy because of A, B, and C, right? So there, perhaps it's kind of an alignment of political economy or economic theories that means that people are saying this is when the economy is produced, because everybody's kind of agreeing that this is what an economy is. And in the 19th century, that's not the case, right? Lots of arguments, right? And you see that in Nehruji's text, right? He has lots of kind of there's one speech in London in 1873 where he's just like critiquing the people have critiqued his national account, right? And that they disagree and so on. But just because you disagree doesn't mean that you're not using counting to produce a national economy, right? But this is just my hunch on what they think. But it is a different moment in the 1930s, 40s. I'm not saying that what they're saying is wrong. I'm just saying I think that the discussions are happening much, much earlier. And yes, there's perhaps more sporadic. Perhaps they're a little bit they're kind of done in their own little circles, perhaps. But I do think that my research, and this is obviously a really long project, right? And I'm not going to finish this for another 5 years or so, right? But so I think what I'm going to find is I'm going to find more connections internationally between thinkers. Like already a case study I've started on Nehruji as well, comparing to an Argentinian individual or someone who becomes Argentinian, but he's European by origin, but he lives most of his life in Argentina, and he produces the first ever national account of Argentina in like 1880 or so. And they both, so this Latzina, if I'm pronouncing it right, and Nehruji both use Mulhall as a source, because he does this, it's a dictionary of statistics, and another book comparing national income estimates of different countries. And MPhil actually talks to this Argentinian, like they actually have an exchange where they disagree on things. MPhil is so there's an indirect connection there. So there is international. There are international connections that are happening much more, and you just kind of have to look there. And because people haven't really looked, they haven't found it. And I'm going to stop there because I don't want to talk too much.
No, it's very interesting to hear all these details. This kind of comparative study is also, it's useful in seeing at least from what else was happening at the same time elsewhere and all. And I mean, of course, I would like to, I mean, I don't think there are right now any questions that have been typed out in the chat. I mean, I know we also have a YouTube kind of I mean the YouTube streaming going on, and there was a question here, but I don't think it has to do with your particular presentation exactly. So
No,
I mean,
but I will.
also, yeah,
I would be happy to talk to that though, because
yes,
if you don't mind, it's on the environmental costs of putting environmental costs into GDP.
Oh yeah,
That
yeah.
last question.
Okay,
And
yeah. I think yes, I have just seen. Yeah. I just saw that
I
appear
just
right now. Sure, please go
so
ahead.
I think
I'll just, if you don't mind, I'll just read out the question because not everyone can view it. That's why, yeah. So Ishan is asking the question, on a separate note, have you come across any scholars who might have commented upon inclusion of environment costs in GDP, as we have green GDP today? Could we have historical perspectives on how to incorporate environment in GDP calculations, leading somehow to integrating environmental and social dimensions? And thank you.
Yeah, this is just like becoming a really big topic in history of economics, and there hasn't really been a project on the history of national accounting, like incorporate the environment into national accounting, but there's like the price of the costs of nature. I think it's a recent book that just came out the end of last year, which I haven't read yet, so I don't have examples yet, but which is supposed to be really, really good, and it's talking about this, so the kind of history of nature in economic theory. And there's a big group now in Paris looking at this, led by Antoine Mismer, and there's one of his PhD students is actually looking at energy in the colonies, and particularly in India, and kind of how energy was dealt with in economic theory by different individuals in India. But nobody's really looked at this, as I said, putting environmental costs into GDP. And so I'm currently starting to see starting a project on that. So I'll just say that really good question, needs to be done, hasn't done yet. I hope to be part of doing it.
That was, I think, a very interesting question, and something because we can also pull kind of national accounting and GDP calculations to the present, and in a sense, because it's the entire economy and the notion of growth has become so intrinsic to it, and it is all about GDP and other factors of like I remember my school time and early some few economics classes where they used to say, is growth and development the same thing, you know? So yeah, so coming to that, and environment now, you can't you can't actually really talk about wealth creation without that. So yeah, so I'd also ask, are there any more questions? Yeah, please go ahead, Maria. Yeah.
No, I just was wondering, because I'm just trying to think out loud about who could have mentioned nature, because in this Nehruji's estimate, I don't see it, but I wonder if the other economists at the time, like Renati, because he talked a little bit about iron and so on. So I'm wondering, but I haven't seen it as in part of an accounting exercise. But then now just thinking out loud, Gandhi, who had a very different idea of what development should be in his self-sufficient villages and so on. I wonder if that's not there, but then he wouldn't have come up with a national account, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
no, so not necessarily. So from what a little bit that I know, sorry if I'm interrupting and if others have questions, but there's also like Radha Kamal Mukherjee from more like early 20th century and all are speaking about some sort of ecological economics. So the interesting thing is that some of these thinkers, say Gandhi or Radha Kamal Mukherjee, they have this very organicist kind of sense of Indian society and economy, you know, so kind of reliant on social existing hierarchical social institutions like caste and the village, because I mean the village was really imbued with caste hierarchies in that sense. So it's interesting to see how some of these thinkers are also, there might be more, there might be other traditions also within, in terms of bringing ecology into the history of Indian economic thought, which possibly I'm not as aware. I'm sure there must be something that comes also from the anti-caste thinking as well there, but has to be kind of explored, right? Anyway, any more comments, Maria, or any other question? We have like just 2 minutes before we can move to the closing remarks for the day.
But Mukherjee is super interesting. I read his whole works too, for my PhD, but didn't end up putting him in because he's the second generation. But I don't remember the ecological. I should look into that.
Just just to mention it, Ishan has also responded saying maybe maybe Buddhist economic thought might have something to say about that. So yeah, that can be I mean that could be considered. Okay. Anyway, so with that, I think we're at the end of the day, of a long day of discussions. And I guess now people are exhausted in a sense to ask more questions. So thank you, Maria. Thanks a lot for your presentation. And thank you to everyone who's been part of our discussions today. And so now I'll hand the stage back to Avaninder to give us the closing remarks for the day.
Thank you, Sharmin. It has been fascinating sessions, I guess, and it was so productive that I could not even leave, for other things. Really amazing. And in fact, what is quite remarkable with this symposium is that it was so diverse in nature. You started papers dealing with emotions, with the personal, taking some, in search of personal life of Keynes, to Islamic thought, economic thought, talking about interest rate theories, and then economies of caste from Ambedkar's writing. Of course, national accounting, which was dealt in her paper, which is from 1850 to 70, which is much before the formal accounting happened by Kuznets and his team in 1913 and all. So all those things are quite diverse, but very strong in delivering some messages. They were very insightful. And in fact, those were so diverse, but yet they were very strongly proposed some very common ideas about it. So one can definitely draw some very important inferences from this symposium. And that's very important because I can highlight 3 very important aspects from this symposium. The one, most of the times when we talk about economic history or history of economics, we think in a linear way. Most of the textbooks are dealing that in a linear way. So this symposium could be a big critique of that linearity, and it talks about it's much wide, much complex than simply treated linearly as most of the textbooks. Second point, which is non-hierarchical also, because most of the times we also read, okay, classical political economy, you have Marxist, then you have mainstream, then it's over. Keynes to some extent criticized, then again took over by the mainstream. It's basically a kind of moving in a progression. So this symposium very successfully criticizes and in fact challenges the notion of hierarchical nature of history of economic thought. And third point, which is very important in my opinion, is if we look at most of the economic thought papers and books, they are quite Western dominated. So in fact, most of the non-Western, I'm talking about non-Western because though this symposium was primarily focused on Indian thought, but in fact, most of the non-Western thoughts remained marginalized in the main discourse of economic thought. There were many academicians who talked about many economic theories in Africa also, Latin America also, India also, where who remained completely marginalized in the main discourse of economic thought. And this, I think, symposium also challenges that very strongly, that typical stereotype Western domination of economic history. And then I think comes the Alex's recommendations that one must challenge the pedagogy of teaching. And in fact, one must understand that in what ways history of economic thought must be taught in the classes. So that, and in fact, very rightly he says that the burden is not simply lying on the history of economic thought, but also on micro, macro, and other disciplines, because this is also true for most of other disciplines as well. So those messages are very clear. And in fact, I would like to share a very important quote by Eric Hobsbawm in his book, which I also share with the students also, because Alex says that it's now the entire discipline of history of economic thought is marginalized. So let me just read out a passage from Eric Hobsbawm's Age of Extremes. And maybe that will give a more sense to the importance of this kind of symposium. So it says that, Eric Hobsbawm says that, it was argued with considerable force, not least by James Keynes, who consequently became the most influential economist of the next 40 years, that they were making the depression worse. Those of us who lived through the years of the Great Slump still find it almost impossible to understand how the orthodoxies of the pure free market, then so obviously discredited, once again came to preside over a global period of depression in the late 1980s and 1990s, which once again they were equally unable to understand or to deal with still this strange phenomena. So it's kind of repetition of same mistake, and should remind us of the major characteristics of history, which it exemplifies the incredible shortness of memory of both the theorist and practitioner of economics. It also provides a vivid illustrations of society's need for historians who are the professional remembrancers of what their fellow citizens wish to forget. So I think in that sense, history of economy, historians who are dealing with history of economics are of extreme importance even now. And I think in that sense, this symposium is rightly placed. So by this note, I must congratulate the team, and in fact thank firstly Dipanshu, of course, because his energetic and enthusiastic leadership was key to key for the success of this event. And definitely I understand Sharmin's effort to bringing everyone together and tirelessly moderating the session from the morning, and it's really inspiring. And in fact, you made it possible. And of course, I must thank Paulimi also, because too many times we were dropping mail without even thinking anything. And in fact, used to get a very prompt reply from her and sorting all the problems, sorting out very immediately. And then I definitely thank all our Constellation members, core members, and all entire support team, because without that, without the collective effort, this event could not be successful. Now, I think it's a big success, and I hope that in near future we will have more follow-up on these issues, and we'll come up with a bigger kind of impact on academics related to it. Thank you. And if I miss anything, please, Sharmin, you can add.
No, I think, yeah, Nindar's covered everything and everyone today. So anyway, just as a last remark, thank you to everyone and all the attendees as well. Many of you have stayed through the day and made it a made it a great success, and for all the questions also that have come up through the day that have really carried the discussion forward. So thank you for all of that, and hopefully in future we should be holding more events, and we should have you in touch. As you can, I think, subscribe to also the Ideas newsletter. You will get more information then. And also tomorrow there is a roundtable as well on the Lok Sabha elections. In fact, Avninder is a part of that again in the panel. So he's having a busy weekend as such. So anyway, it was wonderful to organize the symposium, all the to all the presenters, of course, for coming up with fantastic analysis and papers. So yeah, thank you everyone. And we hope to see all of you participate in future events, and also to have more engagements with people in future. Yeah, thank you.